There is a moment in life that does not look dramatic from the outside. Nothing collapses, nothing announces itself. The day continues with its usual indifference. People keep talking, cars keep moving, screens keep glowing, and yet something inside you begins to separate from what it once believed. A quiet illusion starts to die. The illusion that if the pain becomes deep enough, someone will finally notice. That if the silence becomes heavy enough, someone will hear it properly. That if the inner struggle becomes unbearable enough, the world will pause, turn, and respond with the kind of understanding that makes the weight easier to carry. For a long time, many people live inside this hope without ever naming it. It hides under ordinary behavior, under the need to explain too much, under the disappointment that follows being misunderstood, under the strange instinct to wait before moving, as if some invisible permission still has to arrive from outside. It lives in the part of a person that still believes suffering should automatically produce witness. That pain, by its very intensity, should force recognition. And because this belief is rarely spoken directly, it becomes even more powerful. It settles beneath the personality. It shapes the way a person suffers, the way a person waits, the way a person slowly hands over authority to the world without realizing it. But life keeps revealing the same truth. Most people are not watching that closely. They are not studying your silences, reading the hidden strain in your face, tracing the effort it takes for you to remain composed. Not because you are worthless, not because your pain is unreal, simply because they are already overwhelmed by the burden of being themselves. Each person is pulled inward by private fears, unfinished grief, pressure, uncertainty, fatigue, noise. Everyone is carrying something, and most barely know how to carry their own lives, let alone someone else's inner world. That realization is usually where the first fracture begins. At first, it feels harsh, almost humiliating. To understand that something so loud inside you can remain almost silent in the eyes of others. To see that what felt like a defining storm in your private life did not stop the world for even a moment. Life kept moving. And your suffering, however real, however deep, however exhausting, did not suddenly become sacred just because it was heavy in your chest. This is the part people resist, because it destroys a fantasy that has been emotionally useful for a long time. The fantasy that suffering creates significance on its own. That if the pain reaches a certain depth, someone will finally understand without needing to be told. But the world does not work that way. Pain does not automatically become visible. Struggle does not guarantee witness. And suffering by itself does not force meaning into the hands of others. That is where the real danger starts. Not in the pain itself, but in what pain teaches you to expect. Because if a person keeps believing that suffering should naturally produce care, they begin to live in a state of invisible suspension. They wait to be seen before they move. They wait to be understood before they trust themselves. They wait to be acknowledged before they allow their life to continue. And slowly, without meaning to, they begin building their identity around being noticed, being understood, being emotionally read correctly by other people. At first, that sounds almost innocent. It sounds human, a desire for connection, a desire to be known. But there is a darker structure hidden underneath it. Because once your worth begins depending on being seen properly, every silence starts to wound more than it should. Every delayed response becomes loaded with meaning. Every misunderstanding feels like erasure. Every moment of indifference feels personal. You begin reading your value through the reactions of distracted people. But what kind of foundation is that? What kind of peace can survive there? None. A self built that way becomes fragile by design. It becomes dependent on witness. It becomes vulnerable to ordinary human limitation. And eventually life brings you to the moment where this has to be seen clearly. You thought someone would eventually notice. That is one of the deepest illusions a person can live under. Not always consciously, Often it exists as a quiet background assumption, a subtle hope that if the exhaustion becomes visible enough, if the silence becomes long enough, if the sadness becomes honest enough, someone will finally step closer and understand what has been happening without needing it to be translated. This hope hides in the way people over-explain. It hides in the resentment they feel when nobody asks the deeper question. It hides in the ache of being overlooked. Many people grow up assuming that pain deserves response, that if something hurts enough, someone will eventually recognize it and carry part of it with you. So later in life, even when reality keeps teaching otherwise, some part of the mind remains attached to that old logic. It keeps waiting, it keeps hoping, it keeps standing inwardly at the window, expecting understanding to arrive from outside. But this hope has consequences. It makes a person passive in ways that are hard to detect. It teaches them to freeze instead of build. It teaches them to hold their life in suspension while silently appealing to the world for recognition. So they remain emotionally tied to the fantasy that someone is about to notice, about to ask, about to finally say the one thing that will make the whole burden feel acknowledged. And sometimes no one does. That is the painful threshold. Not because it proves your pain means nothing, but because it reveals how much of your energy was still organized around being witnessed. When that witness does not come, the illusion is exposed. And what first feels like abandonment slowly reveals itself as instruction. Not everyone is going to see you. Not everyone is going to understand you. Not everyone is even going to try. Life is not arranged around your private suffering, no matter how intense it feels from the inside. And harsh as that truth sounds, it is often the beginning of freedom, because once the illusion breaks, your energy has somewhere else to go. Then the second truth arrives behind it. Most people are too busy carrying themselves. This is not bitterness. It is simply one of the clearest realities of adult life. Most people are overloaded by their own minds. They are trying to manage fear, fatigue, pressure, insecurity, disappointment, debt, loneliness, family wounds, unfinished grief, and the constant noise of living. Their attention is fragmented before it ever reaches you. Their ability to hold another person's inner life is limited not because they are monsters, but because they are already fighting to keep themselves together. Once this becomes clear, a great deal of personal pain starts looking different. What you first interpreted as neglect may have been limitation. What felt like rejection may have been preoccupation. That does not always make it less painful, but it does make it less personal. And that distinction matters, because pain becomes much heavier when you keep attaching it to your worth. The mistake is to assume that if people do not respond deeply, then your experience must not matter deeply. But that is a false equation. The depth of your pain and the depth of another person's attention are not the same measure. One says something about what you are carrying. The other often says something about what they are capable of carrying. And there is another truth hidden here. Many of the people from whom you wanted the deepest understanding have never truly understood themselves. They move through life with only partial access to their own motives, their own wounds, their own contradictions. So what exactly were they going to do with the full weight of yours? How were they going to read your inner world with clarity when they are still strangers to large parts of their own? That is why expecting deep recognition from ordinary people can become such a painful trap. You are asking for precision from people who are living in fog. You are asking for emotional depth from people who survive through distraction. You're asking to be carried by those who can barely carry themselves. And then, when they fail, you take their limitation as a verdict on your significance. This is where the mind begins to harden in the right way, not into resentment, into clarity. You start to understand that most people's inability to hold your pain is not a revelation of your smallness. It is a revelation of their human limitation. And once that lands fully, something inside you stops reaching outward in the same desperate way. You stop making your stability depend on what they were never built to provide consistently. It starts moving back toward you, and once the center of gravity begins to move back toward you, another truth becomes impossible to avoid. Pain does not feel loud in the world the way it feels loud inside you. Inside, it can feel total. It can feel like the defining fact of your existence. It can fill the body, distort time, alter the meaning of ordinary days, and make even simple tasks feel heavy with hidden effort. But outside you, life keeps moving at its usual speed. People see fragments. They catch glimpses. They notice surfaces. They do not feel the full weight of what is happening in your nervous system, your thoughts, your private hours, your silent negotiations with yourself, just to remain composed. This gap between inner intensity and outer visibility is one of the most difficult things for a person to accept, because suffering always feels central to the one carrying it. But for others, it is often little more than a passing signal, if they notice it at all. That does not make them evil. It makes them separate. Their consciousness is not arranged around your pain the way yours is. And once you understand that, you begin to see why so much disappointment comes not from pain alone, but from the expectation that the world should register it with the same depth that you do. You may feel as though your whole inner life has shifted. Others may notice only that you are quieter than usual, or slightly distant, or harder to read. You may feel as though you are surviving something enormous. Others may still expect you to answer normally, speak normally, function normally, because from where they stand, the full scale of what is happening cannot be felt. And this is where a person begins to suffer twice. Once from the pain itself, and once from the fact that it is not being mirrored back with equal force. The second suffering is often subtler, but it cuts deeply. If no one sees the scale of it, maybe it is not real enough. If no one responds with enough seriousness, maybe I should not be affected this much. But none of that is true. It is only what happens when a person confuses private intensity with public visibility and then interprets the gap as invalidation. The truth is simpler and harsher. Your pain feels loudest only inside you because it lives there. It is taking place in your body, your mind, your memory, your emotional history, your unfinished meanings. Of course it sounds louder to you. Of course it alters your internal world more than it alters the world outside you. That is not evidence that it is unimportant. It is only evidence that consciousness is solitary in ways people do not like to admit. At the deepest level, each person is locked inside their own interior weather. They can come near, they can care, they can try. But they cannot inhabit your storm from the inside. Once that lands, another illusion starts to weaken with it. The illusion that suffering automatically creates significance. This is one of the beliefs people carry most unconsciously and cling to most fiercely. They assume that if the burden becomes great enough, life will somehow respond differently. That the sheer depth of what they are enduring should force meaning into the situation. But suffering does not work like that. Pain is real, but it is not persuasive on its own. It does not compel understanding. It does not obligate witness. This is a brutal correction, but a necessary one, because as long as a person believes that suffering should naturally generate significance, they remain emotionally tied to a fantasy that keeps them weak. They keep waiting for the burden itself to do work that only consciousness, discipline, and interpretation can do. They imagine that pain, if intense enough, will eventually redeem itself through the response it elicits. But often it elicits very little. Sometimes silence, sometimes impatience, sometimes shallow advice, sometimes nothing. But pain does not become meaningful by being seen. It becomes meaningful by what it is turned into. That is the shift most people resist because it places responsibility back where they least want it. If suffering does not automatically create significance, then you must decide what significance it will have. Not through performance, not through endless narration, through structure, through action, through the way you let the burden shape your mind, your standards, your attention, your relationship to yourself. Pain on its own is only pain. It becomes something else only when it is metabolized into a different form of life. And that is where the deeper problem starts revealing itself. The need to be seen does not remain a simple longing for long. Quietly, almost invisibly, it becomes a dependency. You begin needing recognition not as comfort, but as proof. Proof that what you feel is real. Proof that what you carry matters. Proof that your life has weight. Once recognition becomes proof, your center starts drifting outward. You become more attentive to reaction than to reality, more dependent on being interpreted correctly than on being internally clear. Even your pain begins reorganizing itself around response. You want it witnessed, named, mirrored, affirmed. And the more you depend on that confirmation, the more fragile you become. This is why the need to be seen becomes corrosive. Not because being seen is wrong, but because needing it too much turns every human limitation into a wound. If someone fails to respond deeply, you feel diminished. If someone misreads you, you feel reduced. If someone remains indifferent, you feel erased. And from there, the next step is almost unavoidable. You start measuring your worth through response. A reply becomes more than a reply. Attention becomes more than attention. Presence becomes more than presence. If they answer quickly, I matter. If they notice the change in me, I matter. If they stay, if they soften, if they interpret me correctly, then my experience becomes real in a way I can trust. But when they do not, your worth drops with it. Your pain starts feeling less legitimate. Your identity begins to shake, not because you changed, but because the mirror outside you failed to reflect what you needed reflected. This is the quiet brutality of building a self through response. It makes your inner life dependent on variables you do not control and on people who were never equipped to hold that much power over you. They are simply responding from where they are, from their limitations, their blind spots, their own private burdens. But because you turned response into measurement, every ordinary imperfection in them becomes an extraordinary disturbance in you. That is why a person eventually has to become ruthless with this pattern. Not cruel, ruthless. They have to stop pretending that measuring themselves through response is harmless. It is not. It creates emotional dependence and then disguises it as sensitivity. It trains you to seek mirrors instead of structure. But your worth cannot live there. Not safely, not cleanly, not for long. If you need others to respond correctly in order to trust the reality of your own experience, then your life is already too far outside your own hands. And once you see that clearly, another kind of clarity begins. You start to understand that if your worth rises and falls with how others receive you, then you are not living from self-respect yet. You are still living from appetite. The appetite to be mirrored, to be confirmed, to be emotionally legitimized by the crowd, by a person, by a relationship, by a room. So the task becomes harder and cleaner. Stop asking response to do the work of reality. Stop asking attention to do the work of self-knowledge. Stop asking other people to tell you what your pain means. None of those things are stable enough to carry the weight you have placed on them. And once that truth settles in, the next movement becomes unavoidable. If being seen is no longer enough, and response can no longer be trusted as the measure of your value, then the only question left is this: what happens when you stop waiting to be understood and begin turning inward instead? At first, not peace. That is what people misunderstand about inner turning. They imagine that the moment you stop expecting so much from the world, life becomes lighter, clearer, calmer. But usually the first thing that arrives is not relief. It is exposure. Because once you stop leaning so heavily on the hope of being understood, you are left face to face with what that hope was protecting you from. Your own responsibility, your own authority, your own unfinished relationship with yourself. This is where many people hesitate. They can see that waiting has become painful, but they still do not know how to live without it, so they remain in between. Not fully trusting the world anymore, but not fully trusting themselves either. And that in-between state is exhausting. One part of you already knows that no one is coming to interpret your life for you. Another part still wants to wait a little longer, just in case someone does. But that rescue rarely comes in the form people imagine. And even when support does appear, it still cannot do the deepest work for you. It cannot replace inner structure. It cannot build self-respect in your place. It cannot live inside your mind and reorder it from within. At some point, every serious life reaches the same threshold. Waiting to be understood becomes another form of paralysis. That is the hidden cost of waiting. It keeps your life stalled in invisible ways. You keep revisiting the same emotional terrain, not because there is no way through it, but because you are still trying to bring someone else with you. Still hoping someone will finally see the full shape of your burden and say, "Yes, now I understand. Yes, now you have permission to move differently." But if you tie your movement to that moment, you may wait for years. There is nothing strong about that. It is only familiar. Because the truth is, waiting to be understood keeps you emotionally stuck, not only because others are limited, but because the self becomes addicted to postponement. The mind begins saying, "I would move if they understood. I would relax if they saw what this cost me. I would continue if someone finally met me at the right depth." But life does not owe you that meeting before it asks you to live. And this is where a more difficult form of maturity begins, the maturity of moving without full witness, of continuing without complete recognition, of accepting that many of the deepest changes in your life will happen in spaces where no one else has enough context to validate them properly. At first, that feels lonely. Then, it starts feeling clean. Because once you stop making understanding a condition for movement, the energy that was trapped in waiting begins to return to action. You stop rehearsing your life for an audience that may never arrive. You stop organizing your inner world around the fantasy of being accurately received. You stop trying to make yourself emotionally legible to people who only know how to engage with what is simple and easy to label. You begin to understand that the demand to be fully understood by others is often just a more refined way of avoiding the harder task, which is understanding yourself deeply enough to proceed without their confirmation. That is the turn inward. And the deeper you go into that turn, the more another truth becomes unavoidable. No one can carry your inner life for you. This is the sentence many people hear, but very few fully accept. They nod at it because it sounds wise. But acceptance is not agreement. Acceptance is what happens when a truth stops being philosophical and starts reorganizing the way you live. And this truth, once accepted, changes everything. Because it means that at the deepest level, your mind remains your responsibility. Your healing remains your responsibility. Your standards, your interpretations, your inner order, your relationship to fear, pain, silence, solitude, memory, identity, all of that remains yours. Others can accompany you, they can comfort you, they can love you, but there is a point beyond which no one steps. No one can enter your consciousness and build your structure from within. This is not tragic. It only feels tragic to the part of the self that still wanted to be carried. In reality, it is one of the most stabilizing truths a person can learn. Because once you stop fantasizing that someone else can carry your inner life for you, you stop placing impossible expectations on human relationships. You stop resenting people for failing at a task they were never designed to fulfill. You stop treating every emotional absence as betrayal. You stop asking closeness to do the work of inner architecture. And perhaps most importantly, you stop weakening yourself through the constant hope that someone else will one day become your missing structure. No one will, and if that sounds severe, it should. Some truths are useful precisely because they do not flatter. They cut through illusion fast. They remove the soft lies that allow a person to remain passive. Because once you understand that no one can carry your inner life for you, the entire question changes. You stop asking, "Who will understand this for me?" and start asking, "How will I hold this well?" You stop asking, "Who will make this lighter?" and start asking, "What kind of mind must I build to carry it without collapsing?" You stop asking, "Why did no one save me from this?" and start asking, "What now belongs to me because no one did?" That shift is everything. It is the beginning of actual strength, not visible strength, not theatrical strength, the quiet kind, the kind that develops when a person stops treating support as a substitute for structure, the kind that grows when they stop interpreting human limitation as cosmic abandonment. The kind that forms when they stop reaching outward every time something hurts and begin learning how to remain with themselves long enough to turn pain into order rather than spill it into the world as a cry for rescue. This is not easy work. It sounds clean in language, but in practice it is brutal in its honesty. Because once you fully accept that no one can carry your inner life for you, many old habits begin to die. The habit of over-explaining, the habit of waiting, the habit of making emotional proof a condition for movement, the habit of asking the room, in subtle ways, to validate your burden before you trust your own experience of it, the habit of leaning on response instead of building inner form. These habits do not disappear politely. They fight for survival. They tell you it is too lonely to carry yourself. They tell you it is too harsh to expect so much from your own mind. They tell you that self-reliance is cold, that privacy is hiding, that silence is distance. But most of that is only dependency speaking with emotional language. Because dependency always resists the moment the self begins reclaiming its own authority. And this is where the deeper dignity of the inward turn reveals itself. You begin to understand that self-reliance is not the rejection of all support. It is the refusal to make support the foundation of your existence. It is the decision to become the place where your life remains intact, even when others are absent, distracted, limited, or gone. It is the choice to build a mind that does not shatter every time it is insufficiently mirrored. It is the commitment to stop living as though your inner world requires outside permission in order to become real. Once that commitment begins, something in you changes its posture. The old reaching softens, the need to explain weakens, the desperation to be fully interpreted loses some of its force. You begin to trust the fact that your life is happening inside you, whether or not anyone else has the depth to understand it properly. This is the beginning of internal authority, and internal authority always feels quieter than dependence expected it to feel. There is no applause in it, no dramatic breakthrough, no instant certainty. Usually it looks like a person who speaks a little less, explains a little less, waits a little less, and starts carrying themselves with a different kind of seriousness. The seriousness of someone who is no longer asking ordinary people to perform extraordinary emotional labor. The seriousness of someone who knows that whatever is happening within them must now be handled, shaped, and interpreted at the level of self, not delegated endlessly to others through longing. This is not the end of loneliness, but it is the end of a certain kind of helplessness. Because once you stop waiting to be understood, and once you accept that no one can carry your inner life for you, something essential becomes possible. You stop standing at the edge of your own life, asking who will go first. You go first. Even if quietly, even if imperfectly, even if without witness, even if without the beautiful emotional symmetry you once hoped for. And from there, a different question begins to rise. If no one can carry your inner life for you, then what happens when support fails completely and there is nothing left but your own ability to stand? If no one can carry your inner life for you, then there will come a moment when support fails, and something in you has to decide whether it will collapse with that absence or become more serious because of it. This is where people imagine self-reliance begins as some kind of triumph, as a clean act of empowerment, as a sudden decision to become strong. But that is rarely how it happens. Usually it begins in a harder place. In the moment where what you hoped would hold you does not hold, where reassurance does not arrive, where understanding does not deepen, where the room remains quiet, where the message does not come, where the person you thought would carry part of the burden turns out to be carrying only their own life, just as everyone else is. And in that moment, something sharp enters the picture. Not inspiration, exposure. The exposure of what remains when rescue fails. This is the part of transformation most people do not talk about honestly. They celebrate confidence after it has already formed. They speak beautifully about strength once it has become visible. But the beginning is far less elegant. The beginning often feels like insult, like standing in the ashes of an expectation and realizing how much of your inner stability was built around the idea that someone or something outside you would eventually step in and make it easier to continue. And when that does not happen, when the expected support simply does not materialize, the first feeling is not always nobility. Sometimes it is anger, sometimes grief, sometimes humiliation, sometimes a strange emptiness. But beneath all of it, there is a more important possibility. The possibility that the failure of rescue is not just another disappointment, it is the beginning of internal authority. Because self-reliance begins where rescue fails, not because pain suddenly becomes beautiful, not because abandonment becomes pleasant, but because the absence of rescue removes the final excuse for postponing ownership. It forces a cleaner relationship with reality. It leaves you with no emotional fiction to hide inside, no fantasy of being carried, no comforting story that someone will eventually build your structure for you if you can only endure long enough. The moment support fails, in the exact place where you needed it most, the mind is stripped of one of its oldest negotiations. It can no longer keep saying, maybe later someone will make this bearable for me. Maybe later someone will help me become. Maybe later the right kind of care will arrive and then I will finally stand up inside my own life. That later never comes the way people imagine, and that is not the tragedy. The tragedy is how long people wait for it. There is something almost offensive about realizing how much time has been lost in emotional dependence. How much energy was spent standing at the edge of your own life, waiting for some final confirmation to move. Waiting for one more sign of support, one more reassuring voice, one more person to understand deeply enough that continuing would finally feel safe. But the deeper truth is that life rarely becomes safe first. It asks for movement before safety. It asks for structure before certainty. It asks for self-respect before applause. And for many people, rescue does not fail because life is cruel. It fails because failure is the only thing severe enough to force the self to wake up. That waking up is not loud. Usually it is private. A quieter seriousness enters the body. The same mind that once kept checking outward begins, slowly, reluctantly, turning inward with more discipline. The same person who once wanted to be carried starts becoming suspicious of that desire, not because they no longer value love or care, but because they can finally see the cost of organizing their life around the hope of being held up from outside. They begin to understand that every time they waited for rescue, they postponed a relationship with their own strength. Every time they handed responsibility to future support, they weakened the part of themselves that could have been built through direct contact with reality. This is where pain starts becoming useful in a different way. Not because it is displayed, not because it is explained beautifully, because it becomes instructive. It shows you exactly where your dependence still lives. It reveals the rooms inside you that were still waiting to be furnished by others. It reveals where you were still leaning on emotional outcomes you did not control. And once pain begins exposing dependence instead of merely expressing itself, the whole process deepens. You stop asking how to make the burden look understandable. You start asking what it is teaching you about where your life is still externally governed. That question is much more dangerous than it sounds, because if you answer it honestly, you start seeing things that cannot be unseen. You see how often you reached outward instead of downward, how often you wanted comfort more than clarity, how often you measured support as if it were structure, how often you remained emotionally available to disappointment because some part of you still believed that being held by others was the missing element in becoming solid. It was never the missing element. It was simply the last illusion standing between you and the harder work. And the harder work begins here, in the quiet understanding that whatever is happening inside you now has to be carried differently, not by broadcasting it more, not by waiting longer, not by finding a more sophisticated audience, but by becoming more internally organized than the pain expected you to be. By developing a mind that does not beg every feeling to be resolved through response. By building standards that continue even when encouragement disappears. By learning how to stand in the exact place where rescue failed and let that place become a workshop rather than a grave. That is how self-reliance actually forms, through repetition in invisibility, through keeping promises that no one else sees. Through doing what matters while the room remains quiet, through learning that discipline is not a mood created by support, but a shape you choose even when support is absent, through refusing to collapse into the old emotional logic that said, if no one comes, then I cannot continue. You can. The real question is whether you are willing to stop making absence into an excuse for delay. This does not mean the pain of unsupported moments disappears. It does not mean disappointment stops hurting, but the relationship changes. The pain no longer serves as proof that life is against you. It becomes proof that your structure is being tested. It becomes an invitation to stop romanticizing rescue and start taking your own life more seriously. It becomes the place where you either remain a person waiting for ideal conditions or begin becoming someone who can move under imperfect ones, because the world is full of people who are always almost ready, always one conversation away, one right person away, one final act of understanding away, one better circumstance away. Their whole identity is built around deferred emergence, around the promise that they will really become once life responds correctly to their inner need. But life often withholds exactly what would allow that fantasy to survive. And that withholding, painful as it is, may be the first honest gift it gives you. Because once rescue fails enough times, you begin to stop worshipping it. You begin to see that the part of you waiting to be saved was not the strongest part. It was the most frightened, the most dependent, the most attached to the idea that your future required outside permission. And when that frightened part stops ruling everything, a new kind of force enters your life. Less dramatic, less emotional, more reliable. The force of self-respect, the force of someone who no longer waits for the conditions of their dignity to be arranged by others. The force of someone who begins to understand that whether support comes or goes, there is still a life to be lived, a mind to be governed, a standard to be held, and once that force begins to grow, another correction becomes necessary. Because if self-reliance is to become real, pain can no longer remain a performance. It cannot keep functioning as a repeated signal sent outward in the hope of sympathy, recognition, or emotional proof. At some point, the wound has to stop being displayed and start being worked with. The burden has to stop serving the appetite to be witnessed and begin serving the work of transformation. Otherwise, even self-reliance becomes another costume, another idea spoken beautifully while the old dependency remains untouched underneath. This is the harder line, the one most people avoid because it sounds unforgiving. But it is not unforgiving, it is exact. Pain loses dignity when it becomes a performance. That does not mean expression is weakness. It means repeated exposure without real integration slowly turns suffering into theater. A person can begin narrating pain so often with such refinement that the wound becomes part of their social identity before it ever becomes part of their strength. They start speaking from it, shaping themselves through it, keeping it emotionally alive because it still draws attention, still creates response, still provides a kind of proof that what they carry matters. And in that cycle, healing keeps being delayed because the pain is still doing social work. It is still functioning as currency. This is one of the most dangerous traps in a world that rewards visibility, because the more culture celebrates exposure, the easier it becomes to confuse display with transformation. A person starts thinking that because they can articulate the wound, they have moved through it. Because they can name it elegantly, they have mastered it. Because others have witnessed it, it has been dignified. But language is not transmutation. Recognition is not restructuring. Being seen in pain is not the same as becoming stronger through pain. Sometimes it is the opposite. Sometimes the more you perform a wound, the more tightly your identity wraps around it. The more you teach yourself to return to it, not as raw material, but as presentation. Not as something being turned into structure, but as something being preserved in visibility. And once that happens, the pain becomes harder to release, because it is no longer only suffering. It is role, it is pattern, it is a familiar self. This is why a person who is becoming truly serious has to learn how to go quiet at the right moment. Not to hide, to protect, to prevent the unfinished inner life from becoming a public habit. To stop feeding the wound with attention before it has been disciplined into meaning. There is a moment where pain must leave the stage and enter the workshop. A moment where you stop asking who will witness this and start asking what this must become inside me. That is not repression, it is maturity. And maturity always includes the ability to carry some things without display, to endure some processes without commentary, to let certain transformations happen in silence until they are stable enough to stand without explanation. Not because secrecy is automatically noble, but because constant exposure can weaken what privacy is still trying to strengthen. There are parts of a person that need fewer eyes, not more, fewer interpretations, fewer reactions, fewer hands. Some things grow only when they are no longer being watched, so the line becomes clearer. If rescue fails and self-reliance begins, then pain must stop being offered to the world as an appeal. It must become material, it must become instruction, it must become pressure through which the self grows denser, quieter, less theatrical, less dependent on response. Otherwise, you are still waiting, just in a more sophisticated form. They will not make it meaningful for you. Meaning has to be forged where the noise dies. And that is where the next transformation begins. Because once pain is no longer being performed, once it is being contained, worked and shaped in private, silence itself starts changing form. It is no longer emptiness. It becomes protection. It becomes force. It becomes the place where the inner world is no longer available to everyone, and because of that, it starts becoming stronger. Silence changes the moment you stop experiencing it as abandonment and begin understanding it as guardianship. Until then, silence feels hostile. It feels like a room with no answer in it, a gap where reassurance should have been, a space where response failed to arrive. But once the inner shift deepens, once pain is no longer being sent outward as a request for interpretation, silence begins to take on a different quality. It stops feeling like deprivation and starts feeling like protection, not because everything inside you is settled, but because you no longer believe that everything unsettled must immediately become visible. This is where many people fall back into older habits, because the hunger to be witnessed does not disappear cleanly. It often returns disguised as honesty. It says, "I am just being open. I am just being real. I am just refusing to hide." But that voice is not always wisdom. Sometimes it is just appetite with better language. Sometimes it is the older self trying to survive by making the inner life public again, by turning unfinished feeling into speech too quickly, by seeking relief through exposure before discipline has had time to do its deeper work. And that is precisely why silence becomes so powerful. It interrupts that reflex. It creates a pause between feeling and display, a pause in which something more mature can enter. A person begins asking different questions. Not how quickly can this be expressed, but what happens if I hold this a little longer? What is this feeling before I narrate it? What is it trying to reveal about me, my expectations, my attachments, my old patterns, my unexamined needs? What if the urge to speak is not proof that speech is needed, but proof that the self is still uncomfortable carrying its own emotional weight? That question changes everything, because not everything that is felt deserves immediate release. This is one of the most neglected truths in the modern emotional world. People speak as though expression is always cleansing, always liberating, always psychologically advanced. It is not. Expression can be wise, but it can also be impulsive. It can be clarifying, but it can also be evasive. It can be honest, but it can also be a way of avoiding the much harder act of remaining with yourself until what you feel takes on a clearer form. The fact that something is sincere does not automatically mean it should be spoken. The fact that it is intense does not automatically mean it belongs in the open. Some things become stronger in private. That sentence sounds simple, but most people do not live as though it is true. They live as though interiority must always become language to count, as though privacy is suspicious, as though what is not shared remains somehow less real. But that is only the bias of a culture that confuses visibility with validity. The deeper truth is that many things lose force when exposed too early. A conviction can weaken under too much commentary. A wound can become theatrical under too much witness. A transformation can become diluted when it is repeatedly interpreted before it has hardened into structure. There are seasons in a person's life when silence is not avoidance. It is incubation, and incubation requires boundaries. This is where the movement reaches something even cleaner. Not everyone deserves access to your inner world. That truth unsettles people because it cuts against the emotional vanity of openness. Many want to believe that sharing deeply is automatically noble, automatically intimate, automatically mature. But access is not a moral right. Access is something that should be earned by depth, steadiness, discretion, and the ability to hold complexity without reducing it. Most people do not meet that standard, not because they are evil, but because they are shallow in the ordinary human way. Distracted, reactive, quick to label, hungry for simple stories, skilled at consuming emotional information without knowing what to do with it. Why then would you hand them the sacred parts of yourself? This is one of the great acts of self-betrayal people commit without realizing it. They offer the raw interior to those who have shown no real capacity to honor it. They speak from the middle of the wound. They reveal too much, too early, too widely. Then they feel diminished when the response is thin, awkward, careless, or forgettable. But what else was likely to happen? You cannot hand depth to people who live almost entirely at the surface and then be shocked when they touch it superficially. You cannot turn your private struggle into public material and then feel betrayed that the public handled it like material. This is why discernment matters more than openness. Discernment is not coldness, it is intelligence applied to intimacy. It is the ability to know that inner life has value precisely because it is not endlessly available. It is the understanding that some parts of you become weaker under broad access, that some truths must remain protected until they are no longer vulnerable to distortion, that some emotions must be carried privately until they have stopped needing witness and become capable of standing on their own weight. And once a person begins living from that principle, their whole atmosphere changes. They stop oversharing, not because they have become detached from themselves, but because they have become more loyal to what is deepest in them. They stop explaining every silence because they no longer assume everyone has the right to understand it. They stop translating every boundary because they are no longer trying to make themselves easy to digest. Their inner life becomes less publicly negotiable. And because of that, it becomes more internally coherent. There is power in that coherence. A person who is no longer constantly externalizing themselves begins to feel denser, heavier, not in a dark way, in a rooted way. Their words carry more weight because fewer of them are wasted. Their silences carry more meaning because they are no longer empty pauses filled with insecurity. Even their presence changes. It begins to communicate something without trying. It says, access is not automatic here. It says, not everything in me is for display. It says, what is private is not weak, and what is protected is not absent. And in a world where most people leak themselves constantly, that kind of containment feels almost mysterious. But it is not mystery for the sake of image. That would only be another performance. It is something more serious than that. It is the result of finally understanding that exposure without discernment is a form of self-abandonment. That constant accessibility does not create depth. Often it destroys it. That the hunger to be known can become so desperate that a person starts giving themselves away before they have even fully gathered themselves inwardly. And this is where solitude becomes decisive, because once access narrows, once silence becomes more intentional, once the world is no longer being invited into every unfinished process, a person is left more directly with themselves than ever before. There is less distraction, less explanation, less performance, less emotional traffic moving in and out, and in that reduced noise, something previously hidden begins to come into focus. Not the true self in some romantic, ready-made form. The false self. The version built for approval. This is one of the deepest shocks solitude delivers. You expect to meet your essence, and instead you first meet your adaptations. The voice that learned how to be pleasant enough, understandable enough, soft enough, responsive enough, emotionally legible enough to maintain belonging. The version that kept scanning rooms for reactions, adjusting tone for acceptance, translating silence into danger, making itself available before it was safe to do so. The self that called all this kindness, emotional intelligence, openness, loyalty, maturity. Sometimes it was those things, but often it was fear wearing the clothing of virtue. Solitude exposes that with brutal honesty, because once the audience disappears, the approval-built self begins to malfunction. Its habits no longer produce the same emotional rewards. There is no room to read, no face to impress, no immediate reaction to guide your next sentence, no one to reassure, no one to decode you. And suddenly, the old adaptive machinery looks less like identity and more like survival strategy. You begin to see how much of what you called yourself was actually arrangement. a structure built to reduce rejection and maintain connection, often at the cost of direct contact with your own depth. That is painful to see, because it means the self you thought was simply you is in part a collection of responses to fear. Fear of being misunderstood, fear of being left, fear of being judged, fear of becoming inconvenient to others, and once that becomes visible, you cannot fully go back to living inside it unconsciously. You can still obey it, but now you know what you are obeying. You know the cost. You know the shape of the compromise. And that knowledge begins a death, not a theatrical one, not a dramatic reinvention, a quieter death, the death of the over-explaining self, the over-available self, the self that wanted to be understood by everyone because it did not yet trust its own right to exist without that understanding. The self that made itself emotionally easy to enter because it still believed access was the price of belonging. The self that kept talking long after silence would have served it better. The self that kept proving sincerity to people who had never earned access to the deeper layers of it. That self cannot come with you forever. At some point, if the transformation is real, you have to let it die without explanation. This is one of the hardest acts in the whole process because the old self always has emotional arguments for its survival. It says, "But this is how people know me. This is how I keep connection alive. This is how I avoid conflict. This is how I make others comfortable. This is how I protect myself from being misread." And all of that may be true in a limited sense, but truth is not the same as worth. The old self may have helped you survive. That does not mean it deserves to keep leading your life once its cost becomes unbearable. There comes a moment when the only clean thing left to do is release it. Not with anger, not with self-hatred. That would still keep you tied to it. The old self does not need punishment. It needs completion. It needs to be seen for what it was, thanked for the ways it protected you when you knew no better, and then left behind with seriousness. No announcement, no campaign, no emotional speech, just a different way of moving. Fewer explanations, fewer exposures, more silence where silence is due. More refusal where refusal is necessary. More loyalty to structure than to image. This is where a person starts becoming difficult to categorize, not because they are trying to appear mysterious, because they are no longer organized around public legibility. They do not need everyone to understand their boundaries. They do not need every silence decoded. They do not need every change mirrored back to them before they trust it. They simply begin living from a center that is less externally negotiated. And naturally that unsettles people, especially those who were attached to the older version of you. The version that was easier to read, easier to access, easier to manage, easier to consume. Let it unsettle them. That discomfort is often the first evidence that the old arrangement is ending. Because the real question was never whether people would approve of your inner reconstruction. The real question was whether you would finally value truth more than approval, whether you would choose coherence over accessibility, whether you would protect the inner world strongly enough that the older self, the approval-built self, the explanation-dependent self, would no longer be allowed to run your life simply because it once helped you survive. And when that finally happens, when the false self has been exposed, when access has become more discerning, when silence has turned from emptiness into force, and when the older version of you has begun to die without ceremony, then the final transformation starts becoming visible. You stop needing care in the old way, and that is when the real power arrives. Not the theatrical kind, not the kind that needs an audience to confirm it, not the brittle kind that calls itself strength because it has learned how to hide. A quieter power than that, a deeper one, the kind that begins when a person no longer needs care in the old way. That phrase matters. In the old way. Because this is not about becoming unreachable. It is not about turning love into a threat or closeness into weakness. It is not about training yourself to feel nothing so that nothing can touch you. That would not be power. That would only be injury reorganized into identity. No, the transformation is more exact than that. You do not stop valuing care. You stop depending on it for structure. You stop needing it as the foundation of your reality. You stop requiring it in order to trust your own experience, continue your own movement, or maintain your own worth. Care becomes welcome, but not load-bearing. Beautiful, but no longer essential to your stability. You can receive it without collapsing when it is absent. You can appreciate it without organizing your whole inner life around whether it is present enough. This is one of the most misunderstood shifts a person can go through. From the outside, it may look like distance. To those who were used to your old emotional availability, it may look like coldness. To those who still live through response, it may even look like pride. But what has really happened is simpler and more serious. Your center has relocated. You are no longer built from the outside in. You are no longer asking the world to provide the emotional architecture of your existence. You are no longer standing at the edge of every silence, wondering what it means about you. You have stopped making your inner order dependent on the attention span, emotional depth, or consistency of other people. And because of that, something in you becomes unshakable in a way it never was before. Not because pain disappears, it does not. Not because people suddenly understand you, many still will not. Not because rejection stops happening, it will not. But because your life is no longer organized around trying to prevent those things from defining you. Before, misunderstanding could disturb your center because your center was still partly built from being understood. Before, absence could wound you more deeply because your stability still leaned on presence. Before, indifference could feel like a verdict because your worth was still secretly waiting to be reflected back to you. But now those same experiences do not enter the same way. They may still hurt, but they do not rearrange your identity. They no longer have that authority. This is the freedom most people keep trying to reach through control, image, performance, or detachment, without realizing that it comes from something much quieter. It comes from no longer needing to be rescued in order to continue. No longer needing to be constantly mirrored in order to feel real. No longer needing every important thing inside you to be recognized before you trust its legitimacy. Once that need loosens, life changes in a way that is difficult to explain to anyone who has not lived it. The mind becomes less noisy, the emotional body becomes less desperate, the voice becomes less strained. You stop speaking from appetite and start speaking from choice. And people feel that. They may not know what they're responding to, but they feel it. They feel the difference between someone who is still asking and someone who has stopped asking. They feel the difference between a presence that is trying to be received and a presence that is simply rooted. They feel the difference between a person who is still silently negotiating for approval and a person who has withdrawn from that negotiation entirely. That is why grounded people carry a kind of gravity. Not because they are trying to dominate, because they are no longer reaching. They are no longer asking the room to complete something inside them. That changes how you walk into life. You stop needing to be chosen in order to know your worth. You stop needing to be understood in order to trust your direction. You stop needing to be followed in order to believe you are moving somewhere real. You stop needing to explain every silence, defend every boundary, translate every shift in yourself to those who were only comfortable with older versions of you. You begin to move with a kind of inward permission that has nothing to do with applause. And that permission, once real, becomes one of the strongest things a person can possess. Because now even your relationships change quality. You no longer approach people from inner scarcity. You are not trying to pull identity out of them. You are not asking them to carry emotional labor they never agreed to carry. You are not turning every interaction into a subtle search for reassurance, reflection, or confirmation. You can love more cleanly because you are no longer asking love to do the work of self-construction. You can care more honestly because you are no longer making care responsible for holding your entire inner life together. You can be close without clinging, present without performing, open without spilling, connected without disappearing into the needs of the connection. That is what self-possession looks like in its mature form. Not hardness, not isolation, not superiority. Self-possession. A life in which the self has returned to itself enough that outside response can be received without becoming the final judge of what is real, what is valuable, what is worth building, what is worth preserving. It is a life that no longer treats the world as an emotional court that must approve every private truth before that truth can stand. It is a life that no longer turns pain into appeal, silence into panic, or rejection into annihilation. And with that, another quiet miracle takes place. You begin to care differently too, not less, differently. You stop wasting care on proving yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You stop wasting care on keeping every bridge alive. You stop wasting care on preserving access for those who only valued your openness when it made you easy to enter. You stop spending your deepest emotional energy trying to convince shallow eyes that they have missed something important. That work ends, and when it ends, an enormous amount of life returns to you. Attention returns, discipline returns, direction returns. You begin to build again, not for witness, for reality. You begin to shape your days around what is true, not what will be noticed. You begin to protect your peace as something earned, not something fragile. You begin to understand that silence was never emptiness. It was space. Space in which a truer self could emerge. Space in which the old need for rescue could starve. Space in which your inner life could stop being public property and become structure again. Space in which what hurt you most could stop being a performance and become a source of intelligence. And slowly, almost without drama, a different version of you becomes visible. Not louder, clearer, not more impressive, more exact, not more emotional, more governed. The room may not understand the shift, but it will feel it. The old cues are gone. The old availability is gone. The old over-explanation is gone. The old appetite to be deeply received by everyone is gone. In its place is someone whose life no longer depends on being held in constant view. Someone who can be unseen without disappearing, misunderstood without self-abandonment, unchosen without losing direction, unsupported without collapsing into helplessness. That is rare. And because it is rare, people often call it by the wrong names. They call it detachment. But it is not detachment in the dead sense. It is deeper attachment to what is real. They call it distance. But it is not distance from life. It is distance from dependency. They call it coldness. But it is not coldness. It is warmth no longer wasted. Care no longer handed out in exchange for identity. Sensitivity no longer ruled by reaction. A heart that still feels, but no longer leaks. This is the final maturity the whole movement was pressing toward. The realization that no one caring enough was never the true source of your weakness. The true source was how much power you kept giving to whether they cared, how much authority you granted to response, how much of your identity you placed in being noticed, understood, affirmed, chosen, emotionally carried. Once that power is withdrawn, the whole structure changes. You do not become invulnerable, you become internally led. And that is far more important, because life will always contain absence, misreading, delayed replies, closed doors, half-hearted understanding, people who cannot meet depth because they have never met their own, people who care but not in the way you hoped, people who try but fail, people who leave, people who stay only at the surface. None of that will stop being true. But now it enters a different mind, a mind less dependent on external symmetry, a mind less addicted to witness, a mind that has learned, through disappointment, silence and solitude, how to remain itself without turning every lack of care into a personal collapse. And this is where everything begins to change in a quieter, more lasting way. The appeal ends here. Your life stops feeling like a request sent outward, waiting for the world to answer. Pain is no longer a signal thrown into the distance, hoping to be received. It becomes material shaped inward. Silence stops feeling like emptiness and starts becoming ground. Rejection stops acting like a verdict and starts revealing direction. The old self, the one that kept begging to survive through attention, explanation, and emotional witness, begins to loosen its grip and quietly fall away. What returns in its place is something steadier, your center. And once it returns, a few things become very simple. You no longer need to be seen to feel real. You no longer need to be chosen to feel worthy. You no longer need to be rescued to continue. You no longer need the world to care before you allow yourself to build a life of weight, discipline, and truth. You care now. That is enough. And maybe that is the quiet truth beneath all of this. The world was never meant to become the keeper of your inner life. People will care sometimes beautifully, sometimes incompletely, sometimes not at all. But your life cannot remain suspended inside that uncertainty. At some point, the waiting has to end, and with it, the silent negotiation. What begins after that is not loneliness, but authorship. You begin writing your life from the inside, with clearer hands, with cleaner motives, with less noise between what you know and how you live. You stop trying to turn your pain into something that must first be recognized before it can become meaningful. You stop asking the world to certify your suffering before you transform it. You stop building your worth through who notices, who responds, who understands, who stays. And from that point on, life feels different. Not easier in every way, but truer, quieter, more solid. You begin to see that some of the deepest changes in a human being happen without witness, without applause, without explanation. They happen in private decisions, in withheld reactions, in the refusal to over-explain, in the choice to keep building when no one is checking in the discipline of carrying your inner life with more dignity than display. In the moment you stop asking, "Who will finally understand me?" and begin asking, "Who am I becoming through all of this?" That is when your real life begins. Not the life built around being seen, but the life built around being anchored. Not the life that waits for permission, but the life that moves from inner authority. Not the life that keeps asking the world to care first, but the life that becomes strong enough to continue even when it does not. So, if these words met something true in you today, let that truth stay with you a little longer. Let it follow you into the quieter parts of your day. Let it remind you that not being fully seen is not the end of your worth. Not being fully understood is not the end of your path. Not being rescued is not the end of your strength. Sometimes it is the beginning of it. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying with this reflection to the end. And thank you, as always, for sharing this time and this space with me.